This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by the 5-star novel What Can't Be Hidden by Brandon Andrus. What Can't Be Hidden is right on time for this moment. It is a stunning and universal portrayal of a people awakening and coming to terms with the systems that have promised to give them peace and freedom, while discovering that these virtues can only come from within. What Can't Be Hidden is available everywhere online.
Listeners of podcasts and watchers of YouTube's, people out in the internet, thanks so much for hanging out with us today. We're continuing what I'm calling season 8, where we're talking about open and relational theology. And we've had a lot of great conversations already, but I'm really excited to have my friend Matthew David Segall. I mean, that's a nice biblical name, man. Matthew David.
Yeah, thank my mom for that one.
You're off to a good start. Matt and I have had a chance to interact a little bit virtually. We have a bunch of mutual friends, and I love Matt's stuff. He's a thinker first and foremost, and that thinking kind of manifests itself in writing and in speaking. He's a professor. He's a philosopher where he's applying process-influenced open and relational theology thought across the natural and social sciences, including lots of thoughts about consciousness and lots of thoughts about artificial intelligence. Good Lord, I wish we could get into all of that today. We probably won't be able to. He's a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, and the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Cobb Institute. So I just want people to know we're not messing around. This is the real deal here. Well, the thing, Matt, I found most helpful is your YouTube channel, which is Footnotes to Plato. So for people listening or watching, Footnotes to Plato, that's the number 2. And I think that's your website too. Your Substack is just Matthew David Segall, right?
It's Footnotes to Plato as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. It pops up on my email as, well, if people look for Footnotes to Plato, they're not going to go wrong, right?
Yeah.
They look for that. But I've really enjoyed, I've listened to multiples of your podcasts, when you've been guests in different places, and I've been on your YouTube, and probably my favorite is the Alfred North Whitehead video you made a couple of years ago. I think it was March of 22. And I have definitely listened to that more than 3 or 4 times. Super helpful. And for people listening, and they're trying to dip their toes into it, I think it's because there's just not a lot of stuff like that out there. You feel like you go from 0 to 60 or super fast, which is probably part and parcel of Whitehead stuff anyhow. But I played that video a bunch of times, and also a series of videos from our mutual friend, Andrew Davis. And that was really helpful for me when I started dipping my toes into all of this. But the last thing I want to say is the thing I appreciate most about you is your vibratory presence. It's always very patient and gracious. Some of that I'd like to say is a part of the process, open and relational world. But I don't know that I can claim all of that. Some of that's probably the work that you've done personally. And I just love that. It's one of the things I really do love about ORT is like coming out of evangelical world. And there was a lot of really good stuff about evangelical world. So it wasn't all bad, but there was a lot of stridency and a lot of trying to prove who's right and who's wrong, black and white. And little by little over the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've been able to let go of a lot of that stuff. And a lot of it's because of people like you who are really gracious. And I appreciate that. So anyhow, thanks for being with us, man.
Oh, thanks very much, Jonathan, for that introduction. And been looking forward to this for quite a while. So glad we could connect. And let's see where we go.
And you're in Northern Cal, I assume?
Mm-hmm. That's right. A small town in Sonoma County called Sebastopol.
I love that area. In some parallel universe, I'm living there. What is the math, by the way? What's the latest math on parallel universe? Does it actually hold up? Is it possible?
Well, I don't know the math, but in terms of like the multiverse theory.
Yeah.
or I mean, there's different forms of it. There's the many worlds hypothesis coming out of quantum theory that people like Sean Carroll hold forth about. And then there's the multiverse theory, which is, that infinitely many universes have come out of the quantum void or what have you. And we just happen to be in that one that led to life and intelligence. I think both of these forms, whether a multiverse or multiple worlds, many worlds hypothesis, are an example of the ontological overflow, which is to say materialism in an effort to avoid having to think again about the place of consciousness in the universe, is willing to conjure up all sorts of absurd hypotheses. And these two are an example of that. Talk about Occam's razor going out the window. You're going to conjure infinitely many other universes just so you can explain this one as random. I don't like them.
That's really interesting. Well, I was just looking for some way for me to live in Northern California, but that's why I had to vet it with you. So, oh well.
Sorry to burst your bubble.
That's all right. Our mutual friend, Andrew Davis, he was on the show a few weeks ago, and we had a great conversation about the transitions that our culture is in and has been in. He calls them Whiteheadian transitions. And the way we kind of framed it was like, these are really important things to be aware of, because it opens us up to new ways of thinking about all kinds of stuff, not the least of which is theology, which is kind of what I'm most interested in, but I'm interested in all of it. And that's part of the reason why I love your stuff, because your interdisciplinary thinking is really helpful with all of it. But I thought maybe I'd read a few transitions to get started. Let's see if one of them strikes you that you would want to comment on. I won't read all 10 of them, but here's a few of them. We talked about the move from dogmatic thinking to dynamic thinking, the move from passivity to creativity, the move from decadence to adventure. Here, I'll just give you one more. Pessimism to possibility. Any of those you want to comment on, like in terms of this is why it's really helpful to be aware of process-influenced open and relational thinking?
Yeah, well, I can try to say something about each of those. Dogmatism to dynamism. Well, there seems to me, at least in the little corner of the internet that I tend to pay attention to, which is not the evangelical world really, or, I'm familiar with Tom Ord's work and open and relational theology and that movement, which is very exciting. But I, just wasn't raised in that context and have come to Christianity and to theology later in life, like in my early 20s, after having gone through a sort of Buddhist phase, trying to teach myself to meditate and consuming a very westernized form of Buddhism, of course, in my late teens. But dogmatism has always been something that I've resisted. And in the little corner of the internet that I'm, part of, which there's a bunch of integral theorists and meta-modernists and liminal web people and probably borders on like what used to be called the intellectual dark web and stuff. And, I don't approve of all the people that get involved in these different circles, but in this community of communities, there's been this marked shift toward an interest in Christianity all of a sudden. Some people are publicly converting, and a lot of the times that's to some more traditional form, whether it's to the Catholic Church, converting to Catholicism, or to some form of Orthodox Christianity. And it's a return to a view of religion a embrace of what to me feels like dogma, which, dogma in the original sense just it's like true belief, right? And these are things that over thousands of years have been, mulled over by countless generations of people. And so the best spin we could give to a dogma is that, hey, look, this is deeply considered. You should probably take it seriously. Right. On the other hand, it can get wielded like an idol. Mm-hmm. And you lose the spirit of these teachings and just start obsessing over the particular wording, the letter. And, so much of what I find valuable in that transition to the Gospels from, this long history of prophets and whatnot in the Old Testament is the shift from law to love. And it's not just about obeying the law outwardly, but like, well, what do you feel in your heart? And so, there's already something dynamic in the Gospels and that new revelation, in a sense, that allows us to overcome dogmatism. But I think as religion comes back into the public sphere in different ways, and, that's been true in politics for decades now, since, right. The sort of moral majority or this sort of conservative
religious right.
The religious right coming in, going back to Reagan and whatever. But I think that's accelerated now in different ways. And religion is going to have a role to play in public life. And so the question is it going to be this dogmatic form obsessed with law, or will we be able to tap into a more dynamic form that's rooted in love and understanding the symbols and teachings of the world's wisdom traditions and religious lineages in a way that's fluid and adaptable and not like flimsy and totally relativized, but relevant to contemporary life and the needs of human beings today. Mm-hmm. What's that saying? The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath.
Right.
And then, in terms of decadence and adventure, I think every civilization that we have records of goes through this cycle, and contemporary Western or modern Western civilization does seem to be in its decadent phase. And so, the question becomes, what future might there be for human beings beyond the death of a particular, more or less European mode of existence on the planet, which, for better and for worse in some ways, has, and often violently, created this global economic system and at least the beginnings of a planetary culture. And so, as this old kind of colonial way of connecting the world dies, there's a need to imagine a new form of civilization and a new source of motivation for human beings that's not just to glorify the empire or our nation or our race or our political party or whatever, but to really go on an adventure together as earthlings, as human beings, to imagine the future in a way that's going to need to be radically different, from what we've done heretofore. Mm-hmm. That's going to take, a sense for the possible and a faith in the possible. And we need, there's so much skepticism and cynicism and pessimism nowadays, because our institutions are failing, and there's just very little trust in these established institutions, government, corporate, to function adequately. Whether that's because of bureaucracy or corruption or both. And so how do we rediscover and trust in what's possible beyond the decaying institutions that we are all rightly so fed up with and pessimistic about. But I think it's not just that we need a sense of possibility for how to better organize ourselves socially, but, we need a renewed sense of the possibility of our own human existence and human capacity as individuals. Like, what can I know and what can I do and who can I become? There's a lot of depression. There's a lot of a lack of basic self-esteem that manifests in the search for forms of compensation for that deep sense of self-hatred that a lot of people have because of just poor schooling, parents who weren't ready. I mean, what parent is ready? But who just weren't even adults themselves, and
Right.
And so there's a lot of traumatized, damaged people that lack a sense of their own potential. And so, yeah, shifting to the dynamic, creative, adventurous sense of possibility is of urgent need right now.
Yeah, well said. I think so. And what I've discovered is process, open and relational thinking is a really nice paradigm, a really nice way to move into that. That doesn't mean that there aren't other spaces to do that, but it's been natural. I started to say fun. Some of it hasn't been fun, but it's been meaningful and insightful to kind of reconnect or to connect with what some of the things I was intuiting, like the spirit of adventure, love. And I'm not saying we have a corner on love, but it feels like when you talked about, I was thinking of this when you were talking about not, what did you say? You didn't say wishy-washy or relative.
Yeah.
One of the really meaningful things that I've done in my life over the last few years is to reapproach love and to think of it and okay, what is going on? What is an uncontrolling love? What does that mean? And what does that require of a divine and require of humans? And so the word consent, the concept of consensual, the consensual idea has been like super important. And the more you think about it, you realize, no, actually, this is a more robust, stronger, in many respects, type of love than, of course, the dogmatic crowd wants us to think. I find that very interesting, that game that kind of gets played all the time.
Right. Yeah, that's shift from force to persuasion.
Right. Right. That was one of our other transitions we talked about too. Mm-hmm. So let me change subjects. That was just like a softball. That was just a warm up question.
All right.
I mean, come on, it's Andrew's stuff, right? It's just. I was reading recently in your Physics of the World Soul, which remind me, was that your dissertation turned book, or was that?
It was actually one of the sort of, we call them comprehensive exams before the dissertation that I expanded. And
I knew it was something to do with your PhD work, but so Physics of the World Soul, for people who are interested, by the way, you did that through Sacrisage, and I'm editing lots of books at Sacrisage. So a little shout out there. You said Whitehead prophetically recognized what is finally starting to be acknowledged by physicists today, that post-classical scientific cosmology has passed into an epicyclic,
yeah,
phase of theoretical development. So this was a new word for me, epicyclic, and it's kind of caught my imagination. But you're talking about the idea of here between quantum theory and the theory of relativity. And these are two different ways to see reality that can't really be reconciled with each other. But the epicyclic, can you maybe explain? I know we're on audio here, so some people might know, but it's more of a word picture. But what might be happening with that concept, that phrase? And because I have a question, I'm going somewhere with it.
Yeah. Well, so just briefly, epicycles were a geometrical trick that Ptolemy, the ancient Greek astronomer, developed to save the appearances, as it used to be said, which is to say, the planets appear to move in these loop-like patterns if you track them night after night over a year or two or three or many years. The outer planets move much more slowly, right? So they go retrograde less often. The inner planets like Mercury and Venus more often, and Mars. And so seeing these wandering motions, Ptolemy, as a good Aristotelian and Platonist, said, okay, well, there must be some underlying order or symmetry here. And following Aristotle, who said that all perfect motion, and in the heavens, the heavenly spheres, all motion is perfect, whereas in the earthly terrestrial sphere, there's wayward motion and things get more chaotic. But in heaven, everything should be perfect circles. And so Ptolemy, using his geometrical imagination, devised this brilliant geocentric conception of the solar system, whereby the movements that appear to us to be retrograde, or these loops, are actually just the planets not only moving in circular orbits, but upon that orbit, another circle is added. And so the planet's moving around in on its circle, and then there's deference, and you get circles on circles. So
it's like multidimensional versus like a 2D picture kind of a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so an epicycle is more or less a kind of mathematical fudge to make what we observe become the expression of some underlying order. So if we observe a seemingly wandering motion, which is what planet means in Greek, it's actually just the expression of this underlying perfectly circular motion. And so in the context of contemporary cosmology, scientific cosmology, because quantum theory and relativity theory don't fit together, one, just as an example of why they don't fit together, one relativistic theory describes the space-time continuum, and the other, quantum theory, describes the ultimate nature of reality as being discrete, discontinuous. And so how the two fit together is an ongoing research project, and there's dozens of different attempts to do this, from quantum gravity to string theory. But the problem is that it's very difficult to confirm which of these models is true. And when it comes to cosmology, there's the so-called Big Bang theory, which nowadays involves theoretical constructs like dark matter and dark energy. And dark matter is a mathematical fudge, like an epicycle, created to save the appearances. The appearance, the observation, when we look at other galaxies, the stars around the edges of those other spiral galaxies are moving much more quickly in their orbits around the center of the galaxy than would be expected if the only mass was visible matter. Right. And so, in other words, Einstein's and Newton's understanding of gravity lead us to expect much slower motion of those stars than what we observe. And so what's the solution? Well, it can't be that our theory of gravity is wrong. We have to invent a bunch of invisible dark stuff that explains the missing mass. You just plug that into the equations. Oh, and then the planet, and then the stars are moving at the right speed. Similarly, with dark energy, it's another epicycle in the sense that we observe an accelerating rate of expansion. When we interpret, I shouldn't say we observe that, we interpret that based on what we do observe, which is a redshift in the light coming from certain stars, which through various means astronomers are able to determine the distance between stars. And it seems like, at least as the theory suggests, that the stars and the galaxies, rather, that are further away from us have a larger redshift, which is interpreted to mean that there's an accelerating expansion of the universe. Now, what's observed and what's a theoretical interpretation gets really sort of complicated here. But the basic idea with this the epicyclic nature of contemporary cosmology is that there's a lot of theoretical elaboration and a lot of maneuvering of what are called the free parameters in the equations of physics to get them to conform with what we observe. And we're no longer dealing with a simple explanation of observed phenomena. We're dealing with a heavily mathematically elaborated attempt to fit the observations to the theory. The theory, strictly speaking, of the Big Bang and everything, with dark matter, dark energy, it's been falsified many, many, many times. But it turns out that, science can just adjust the theory to fit the new data and continue to act as though it's the correct theory. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think there's a lack of imagination, and we're waiting for that next Einstein or, next Niels Bohr to grasp the gestalt and come up with a simpler account that would do away with all of these mathematical fudges, with all of these epicycles. So it's a little bit longer than I was hoping, but that's the basic idea.
No, it's super fascinating. So the epicycle was created as a way to give us something to observe, to help our brain understand some of the stuff, we don't understand. Is that a way of saying it?
To fit what we observe to a model.
Fit what we observe to a model. Yeah. So since I read that a few weeks ago, I've been thinking of epicycles in lots of different things, and I've been seeing this, like the complexity of a particular thing, maybe a person, or maybe a politic, or a nation, or a community, and then in my brain, like, close my eyes, and I'm seeing all these other things orbiting around it in multi dimensions, and I'm just finding that word picture like really helpful. But it's interesting to hear you talk, because epicycles they may not be exactly what's going on, but they're helping us match up what we're observing, and that's so true in reality. And so where I want to go is I want to say something about theology and something about the cross, and just see if you have any input on this. And if you don't, it's totally fine. But and I think maybe because it's been Easter Lenten season that we just came out of, so I've been thinking a lot about the cross. And I've had a lot of questions from folks about other ways to think of the cross other than the one Americanized Christian Western way, which it's just transactional, has to do with bloodshed, and it's something I categorically reject, which all of a sudden, of course, puts you on the outskirts with a lot of Christian folks. So, and I'm not the only one doing this, but I've been trying to say, no, there's all these other ways to see what happened at the cross, which was a very real event 2,000 years ago. I mean, somebody named Jesus died there. That may be about all we know. But so now I'm thinking in terms of all these, what sometimes are called atonement theories and epicycles that are rotating around it, that we're concocting. I don't know if we're concocting all of them, but maybe we're concocting them to help us understand the cross. Some of them, I think, maybe they are reality, but you can correct me if I'm not thinking of it correctly. But so I'm thinking in terms of one of the things that rotates around is this idea that whatever's going on with the crucifixion, it reveals the scapegoating mechanism. And I'm a Rene Girard guy, so I'm kind of deep into the mimetic theory and scapegoating stuff. So that might be one of the things orbiting around the cross. Another thing that's orbiting is the way, it's so obvious the way the powers join together in collusion. Herod representing the financial system, Pilate representing the politics, Caiaphas representing the religious system. They all join together in unison. And Girard talks about unanimity minus one. Like there's nothing quite like the power of being in unison, but you always got to get rid of one, the scapegoat. So that might be one of the things that's rotating around this thing we see in the cross. Another idea, there's dozens of them, but another one might be just that this brown-skinned Hebrew man was committed to identify with the marginalized, like the text says he became a friend of sinners. That was one of the things. Can you imagine that? Being a friend of sinners? That was one of the things that got him in trouble. Mm-hmm. On and on, like all this different stuff. So I'm seeing it as this epicyclic thing, like the cross is this observable thing that happened, and then there's all these theories. Although some of that I just said I think are more than theories. But here's the last thing. I said all that to ask you about this, and you can comment about any of the previous stuff too. But one of the things rotating around the cross for me has been this idea that Jesus, who I think was an embodiment of love, and Christians want to say he's the Son of God, and I'm not sure. He never references himself as a Son of God, but let's just say that he was embodiment of love or the Son of God. Either way, whatever else is going on, Jesus experiences the despair on the cross in ways that really surprise all of us, because you wouldn't think the Son of God would do that. And if Jesus is reflective of God, Jesus goes to his death saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? So as a relational thinker, I reject the idea that God was separate from this event. So I have to accept that the divine was interconnected with this. So what does it mean that God in Jesus, or Jesus in God, or both in this entangled way, are experiencing this deep rupture, like this tear? In philosophy, this better than I do, but we may talk about a lack, like there's this void, there's this gap, there's this insecurity, this anxiety, or which are all might be synonymous terms. And so I've been trying to play with a theology, and I don't think I'm the only one, but I'm trying to play with a theology that has a breach in it, a tear in it, and to try to come up with more things revolving around the cross to try to identify better. But I was really curious if you had any comments about this, and if your thoughts, either from your more philosophical bent or from Whiteheadian, which might be philosophy too, or it might be physics, math bent. You might want to comment on the divine having a gap, having a break. The phrase is, and I know this isn't novel with me, and I'm not sure if this comes from Hegel or somebody, but it's the HOLE, the hole within the hole, the HOLE inside the WHOLE. And so I'm constantly trying to articulate something that's happening at the cross. That might better give a better picture of what the reality of the divine is, something like that.
In the Kabbalah, the Godhead is described as creating through an act of self-annihilation to open up a space. There's a self-emptying, or kenosis, to open up a space for the creation. And so the crucifixion is in some sense a repetition of that, perhaps at a higher octave. There's a recreation of the world occurring in that moment. And that act of creation actually requires God to become a human being and die, become an atheist even on the cross, and then die. And what does that mean? Well, that old form of relationship between God as something utterly transcendent and beyond, with earthly humanity has been transformed. And now, I mean, this is just my reading. Maybe it's heretical, unorthodox, and everything and worse. But the idea, as I understand it, would be that, now it's not that God is dead in some sort of flat, or just secular kind of sense, but that God, through the incarnation and through the death and through the bleeding into the earth and really becoming one among us as human beings, now it's up to us to resurrect the spirit of the divine in our communal life together. And so, And
can I just interrupt real quick?
Mm-hmm.
I think I agree with that. What does it mean to resurrect the spirit of the divine if the divine has a continual breach in it, a continual rupture, a continual... I don't love self-annihilation. That sounds really flagellant, like violent towards self. But that idea, what does it mean to resurrect something in your thoughts? I'm not saying you or me have the exact answer. I just find it super interesting, and I'm trying to come up with language for it. What does it mean to resurrect the thing that keeps dying, or that has the possibility of death in it?
Yeah. Well, I think it means that for human beings to love one another, whatever form that love takes, friendship, romance, a colleague, the love is beyond death. In other words, you're not loving some of the sensual, physical qualities of that person. You're not just loving some of even their mental attributes, that they're good at this or that. What you love is their soul or their spiritual nature. And you love that part of them that doesn't die. And so it's a calling to a higher form of relationality that's not merely rooted in some selfish craving for a temporary pleasure, that you don't take with you when you die. And it's not that we know what happens when we die, but I think there's something about the nature of love and this deeper form of love that compels us to relate to one another in a way that transcends our own finite bodily existence, at least in this particular life. And, again, it's not about having some knowledge about what happens after we die. It's just through love and its transformative power, we no longer feel threatened by it. Mm. Right. And so much of what ails our societies and inhibits our capacity for sociality and social coexistence has to do with, I think, the fear of death and the denial of death, which leads to greed and avarice and all of these other social maladies. I think they ultimately stem from the fear of death.
Can I read for you Hebrews 2:14? Sure. I wasn't planning to read the Bible, but I think what you're saying is in alignment with this, and you may already know this. You probably do, but since the children have flesh and blood, he too, this would be the Christ, shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. And I can't remember 15. Yeah, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. That's basically what you just said.
Yeah.
Nice job. Nice commentary on Hebrews 2:14 and 15.
Thanks for connecting it. Yeah. That's right.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just thought that was cool.
But in terms of, I think the whole history of theodicy, or the attempt to figure out why there is evil and sort of reconcile that with a God who is supposed to be loving and all good and all powerful. I think theodicy has often been epicyclic in the sense that it's an attempt to explain away suffering and in a way that's not ultimately satisfying. And there's something about the crucifixion and the death of God, or the Son of God, but one God, three persons, or however you want to think about that. There's something about that event, which is not a theory, but here we can draw on the original Platonic sense of theoria, which was related to theater, which for the Greeks was a sort of public religious event where there was an opportunity for catharsis, or a sort of shared suffering through the artistic expression of the deeper meaning of their own coexistence, right? And so the Christ event, the crucifixion as a theoria, as an opportunity to participate in this transformation which is occurring, that gets us beyond just this attempt to rationally, logically justify how it is that there should be evil because this is how God works. I mean, like, one of the best examples of that, brilliant as Leibniz is, this early modern philosopher, he would say that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and God created the world in a way that, because of just logical incompatibilities and whatnot, has this what we call evil in it. But just the idea that this is the best of all possible worlds is a logician's way of resolving this question, whereas the Christ event, or the crucifixion in particular, I think has a different pathos, and it has a transforming pathos, and we can't logically explain it. It has nothing to do with some intellectual form of justification. Even to try to think of it as some kind of sacrifice or a transaction or exchange. I mean, no, that's, you're bringing economics into something that is actually spiritual.
Right.
So
can I add to, I just want to comment on, like, I always feel checked. I shouldn't say always. Sometimes I forget and then I feel really bad. So I need to remind myself more often that at its core, maybe kind of what you were saying, like, screw the theories for a second. At its core, and this is what Girard helped me see more than anything, it's an innocent man being murdered by the powers. And whereas most of our world whereas we all operate by certain myths, the mythic structure certainly of Jesus's day, and it still exists, it's just we're more modern mythic. But the mythic structure in Jesus' day, whether inherited from the Greeks or wherever, was that the victim was actually guilty. In the Jesus story and the New Testament, at least I think 7 times, there's that really important phrase: "This man was innocent. This man, was not guilty of the crimes that have been laid on him." And so, at some level, like, it's embarrassing. Like, I should just stop talking about it. It's a freaking murder by the powers. And this is what we do, right? And so to create all these epicyclic things around it, it's almost an exercise in missing the point. For me, I'm not saying necessarily for other people. Like, I just need to pause and think about that more. The problem is there's still all this other stuff going on because it's such a complex, interesting thing, but I don't know, something you said made me think that I need to remember that.
Right. I mean, it's a murder, but also I feel like just as Jesus was friends with the sinners, that, as he says on that last night on Good Friday, right, that forgive them for they know not what they do. And forgiveness is such a core teaching here.
Right. Yeah, he's saying that on the cross while they're doing it to him.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so forgiveness itself is something that helps us define reality, define what's going on, even though it's an abstract thing that you can't quite grab, but it's also something that very much you have to enter into.
Yeah, and it's forgive others and forgive yourself too. And almost the depth of forgiveness that transcends that very dichotomy between self and other.
Say more about that.
Well, just in the way that Jesus relates to the Father. There's 2 persons there, and yet not. And I think when we love someone, we are in some sense coming into unity, but to maintain relationship and dynamism in that relationship, there still needs to be a distinction. But still, forgiveness is, we cannot be a self, nor can we come into relationship to others in a loving way without that, without forgiveness. Because, I mean, I was talking about sort of the lack of self-esteem that I think plagues people. You might feel, it might on the surface feel like everyone's super inflated and egoism is running rampant, but it's actually a very shallow form of compensation that runs wild, and that underlying that is this deep sense of insecurity,
right?
Because we don't feel like we're deserving of love, and we can't love others because we want to blame them for what afflicts us. And so, yeah, that's forgiveness. It just runs so deep. It's really right at the core. Everything spills out from our ability to forgive. And again, a way that is deeper than just forgiving ourselves for being sinners or falling short or forgiving others for hurting us, for harming us, or for harming others, but forgiving, again, at a level deeper than even that distinction between self and other. It's like how we overcome that division almost. Yeah, I mean, hopefully what I'm gesturing towards makes sense. I know it's kind of inchoate, but...
No, it's part of it is that's the reality. Girard has this great line. You were talking about lack and insecurity and the anxiety. He says it's that he's trying to describe this human condition that we all, it's a common denominator. We all feel it at some level. That dark country of anxiety that subsists within us and whose action upon us never ceases. Mm-hmm. I love that line.
Right. Which is why forgiveness is every day. Again.
Yeah.
It's not just once and done.
Right. It's a dynamic thing, kind of like some of the stuff we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's trying to live in that space of knowing that's who I am as a human. And that God, a relationship with God doesn't fix that. It doesn't fill the gap, complete that lack, that breach. Because there's always just a bit of, insecurity and agitation there. I think that's a part of what it means to be human. I suspect for our humanity to evolve, you mentioned something like that earlier, which I appreciated. I suspect for humanity to evolve, all of our religions, need to be infused with more grace and forgiveness of ourselves and of others. It's more than I suspect. I'm pretty much banking on that. Mm-hmm. But I'm not very, I got to get better at it myself.
Yeah. I mean, that's the collective task. Like we can't do it by ourselves. I mean, this is part of what I mean by it's beneath the split between self and others. Like we can't actually fully do it by ourselves because we all need to do it together. Right. It's like if I forgive everyone, but they don't forgive me, well, then that's eventually going to make, because I'm human, that's going to make me be like, well, fuck this. I'm, like, what are you doing?
Right.
Right. So yeah, it's definitely one for all and all for one type of thing.
Yeah. Individuals and interdividuals at the same time, independent and interdependent at the same time, which we don't do a great job of. But that's another thing that open relational theology, I think, helps us with. It helps us stay in community, in connection with other people. It doesn't mean that we still at certain scale, we're an individual, but another scale, like you're saying, it's constantly within the whole. It's fascinating. When I first started hearing about this idea of ingression and concrescence and this thing that's coming from, I've heard you talk about, you'll use Platonic, like the eternal, what am I trying to say? Eternal
objects.
Yeah. Eternal forms, eternal objects. And in that ingressing into a subject's life that wants to become a superject. Is that right? Is that the movement where it's all going? Is that, so where I first heard that, I thought of my Wesleyan background. I thought of prevenient grace, the grace that goes before us, ingressing. Since then, I don't know why. I don't know why it has to be prevenient grace. I think it's just grace. I don't think there has to be special quality to it. But is that a way to think of? Is it heretical to think of grace as an eternal form, or eternal form as grace that's constantly ingressing in our lives and influencing us?
No, I like that. Whitehead's way of construing the situation in his terms is that we relate to this realm of possibilities or eternal objects, which are akin to the Platonic forms, ideas. We relate to it always mediated by God. Like the ideas don't just exist out there free floating in nothingness. They exist in the mind of God, or in Whitehead's terms, in the primordial nature of God. And that primordial nature of God is Whitehead describes the relationship between that divine mind and the forms as one of envisagement. So the divine is envisaging this realm of possibilities, and through that envisagement, giving it some ordering, and it's an aesthetic ordering, it's a moral ordering that tilts possibility as such, just infinite possibility. It tilts that realm of eternal objects, as he refers to it sometimes, toward value with a capital V, towards beauty and goodness and truth, towards love. And we as finite creatures relate to that realm as envisaged by God through what Whitehead calls the initial aim. And this is every moment of our experience, every concrescence is inaugurated by its reception of this gift or grace from God, this initial aim, which is sort of the finite repetition of that infinite envisagement. And as repeated for our finite situation, it's providing a sense of relevance and relevant novelty to get each moment of our experience started and oriented amidst the entirety of the past and the welter of alternative possibilities that exist for us to ingress so as to interpret that past. This gets really metaphysical and heady really quickly, but the basic idea, I think, is summed up beautifully in this statement Whitehead makes in his book, Religion in the Making, where he says, God in the role of this initial aim is like a mirror held up to each creature to reflect back to it its own greatness, its own ideal possibility, in other words. And God is not determining that the creature must realize that ideal, but this initial aim, this whisper from God, this grace, this gift is it provides us with that opportunity to bring more beauty into the world, more goodness into the world. And, you know, how we respond is a function of our own self-creation, because Whitehead does have this radical democratization of creative power, right? So God is not omnipotent in the traditional sense anymore. God's not determining what happens. God is, you could still say God is all powerful, but power here becomes a two-way street. It's relational power, in other words, and that means it's just as receptive as it is active, right? It's the power to be in relationship. And so rather than God being an all-powerful creator, I would say God is an all-powerful relator, right? We can still say omnipotence and all-powerful if we construe it in this way. It's the power of love, not the power of force.
Right.
And so as this all-powerful relator, you know, God is luring us toward what would be most beautiful moment by moment. But we are self-creating beings. And Whitehead says every act of creation is a social effort employing the whole universe, right? So to say we're self-creating beings is not to say we're out of relationship, right? We create one another. We create ourselves out of one another. And in our superjective nature, which is, you know, what we become after our subjectivity is achieved in each moment of concrescence, we perish, Whitehead would say, we die and we become superjects. And it's only in our death, as we die to our own subjective immediacy, we become superjects. We're objectively immortal. This is all Whitehead's language. And it's only in that death and perishing, becoming superjects, that we can affect the future. And so all of our moral acts, in other words, we decide to do something in the present, but we won't be there as the same subject to see how we affect the future as a result of the decision we make in the present. Whitehead says no thinker thinks twice. We're becoming new in each moment. We're creating ourselves and we're creating the others who are in relationship with us moment by moment. And so grace plays a huge role in all of that, to the extent that we are able to create a more beautiful world together. It's a function of divine grace, meeting our own creative agency and response to that grace. Yeah. So yeah, a mix of poetry and metaphysics there.
No, I love it. That's good stuff. It made me think, yeah, we may not see, we won't probably see the effect, the way we're going to affect the world, our choices. Who knows what they'll turn into? It made me think of when Jesus talks about, you're going to do greater things than I will ever do. Like that makes sense in the context of what you're saying, because as he perishes, he's I'm thinking of waves, vibrations, like he's moving all that forward, and if we're open to that, we're catching that, and then we're living in harmony with that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that'll preach, man.
Yeah.
How do you answer when someone talks to you about this persuasive love and the fact that God doesn't control, which I'm so thankful to have discovered all of this. Like it really kind of saved my soul, really, probably, and physically it might have saved my life too, but God doesn't control. I think love is patient. That's a biblical term, biblical phrase that I'm down with, I'm committed to. But there's no guarantee. So how do we know love is gonna, I'm not even sure I'm asking a question well. How do you respond to that? How do you know, how is there any, yeah. Is it all just a big risk?
How do we know we're saved?
Yeah. Where's it going? What's going to happen? What's the future? How do we know? Here's the main piece of the question. It's justice. How do we know justice is going to be served to those who have suffered from the unbelievably unjust things in this world if God can't force it to happen?
On some level, I don't know that we would be satisfied if God could force it to happen, because what we really want is for those who have done us harm and who have done harm to others to realize that themselves and to apologize. We want to be able to forgive. And so I don't know that we would ultimately be satisfied with punishment and revenge. It's not satisfying. I don't think it's what we really want. It might be a form of immediate gratification.
I think you're right. I think it's hard to say that to someone who has just been abused.
Right.
But I kind of think you're right. Yeah.
Healing is not revenge.
Right.
But it is a risk. I mean, it's the creation of the world was a risk. What Jesus Christ did was a risk.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody wants a story to live within a story where the end is already known and written.
Right.
And this is not just a story. At least it's not one that's finished. Right. And I think that element of risk is just essential for love to be, because if it's determined, if it's forced, if it's staged, if it's set up in advance, and you're just going through the motions, it's like, that's not what we want.
No.
We want love as an act of freedom that could have been otherwise, and that, the possibility of failure is part of what makes success of value. And so you just can't have an adventure without that possibility. And that's easy to say. And I know, when we're deeply suffering, when we're in pain, when we've been harmed, when we're victims of injustice, these words may fall flat. Mm-hmm. But, I think it's important to be able to, when not in those intense forms of suffering, to be able to take in, and it's not that the suffering is irrelevant. I mean, that needs to be spoken to directly.
Right.
But from a place of, a bit of remove from the extremes, to be able to take in the whole picture and have a more balanced view of this, and to just really understand what we ultimately really want, right, is to be healed and not to just continue the cycles of vengeance. Evil cannot be defeated by force, because what happens when you attack evil in an attempt to subdue it violently, what happens? Evil takes root in you.
Right.
It spreads.
Beware the monster, lest you become the monster.
So when Jesus says, turn the other cheek, that's a very difficult teaching. But if evil eats itself, evil can only destroy itself. Mm-hmm. And as soon as we project it out onto the other and seek to defeat it, we become it, right? That very act of projecting it out is evil. That's what evil is. That's what it does.
Well, and it's funny too, the way you're talking about it reminds me again that evil lives by the myth that it can control, that it can force an effect to happen, but you can't really control anything. I mean, you can heavily influence some stuff.
Right.
So evil is also lack of patience. Like, I'm going to exact my vengeance. It's funny how it works on several levels. So yeah, evil is a type of fake guarantee.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the pursuit of coercive power or non-relational power, which can't and doesn't actually exist. I mean, this is why evil is often described as a nothing, as a lack, because there's some way in which it has no independent existence. And I think, evil can become a positive force that needs to be contended with, and the resistance that is that it provides has an educative role for the soul and for human beings. But I guess it's all in the dosage, so to speak. And that, we need to, on some level, in order to not relate to evil as something we might be able to defeat by exerting our control over it, to realize that this adversarial energy is on some level, like Judas turning in Jesus to the Roman soldiers. It's like Jesus needed Judas to do that. That's what needed to happen. Judas is forgiven by Jesus, at least. And it's like the snake in the garden has a role to play. There wouldn't have been a Christ if that.
Would it be okay to finesse that a little bit and say that Jesus didn't need Judas specifically to do that, but that Jesus responds to this coercive move of evil with a counter move? It happened to be Judas doing that, right? I just wouldn't want someone to think that, that I know you're not saying this, but I wouldn't want a listener to think that what we're saying is that God had premeditated this thing that Judas did specifically, right?
Right. Yeah. Didn't mean it that way. And some orchestration of each detail on this person who does that or whatever, but just that, that deed of betrayal actually functions as a crucial moment,
Yeah, it's crazy when you think about it. Like that move, and then love, I think part of the answer is love always has a counter move. Love is always, it's like indefatigable. It just never gives up. Sometimes I say when people ask about the risk piece and the guarantee, and so I've said there are no guarantees except the guarantee of love. I kind of like it.
Right. And love doesn't mean there's no loss. It doesn't mean that there's not tragedy.
Right.
You know?
Right. So that's our guarantee. That's the piece somehow to help humanity evolve. We have to lean into that.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you read any Tolkien, like Lord of the Rings and
Yeah.
have you read any of the Silmarillion? And
I try, man. It's like reading Whitehead.
Yeah.
I try. I think I tried about most recently, like 2 years ago. I'm like, I gotta do that. But anyhow, yeah, go ahead.
Just his creation story of Iluvatar or Allfather and the Ainur, or the angels, the host around the Allfather, and the way in which there was one particular Ainur or angel, Melkor, who, as God was creating, he was spinning out these beautiful songs and this harmony, and all of the angels were just rejoicing in this. And then one of the angels, who was particularly talented, this is very close to the Christian mythos, but one of the angels, Melkor, decides, in an attempt to glorify God, to do something more creative. Let's work a new tune into this. And some of the other angels start to follow Melkor, and there's disharmony and discord thrown into the mix, and like heaven starts to teeter. And what Iluvatar does is just brings forth another harmony that includes the discord that Melkor had brought forth, and it's unimaginably more beautiful because of the disturbance that Melkor had introduced. Nice. And that keeps happening a few times, and that the creation of the physical world and everything is a spin-off of this call and response, where Melkor, initially as an attempt to glorify the divine, becomes a little bit selfish about his own ability to be more creative. And while Iluvatar can always out-contextualize that effort, it leads into space and time, basically. Yeah. Right? And this whole drama of God's relationship to the creativity of creatures. But love always wins in the end. There's always like another harmony that can atone for, and in other words, unify what had for a moment there been a bit discordant, and everyone, all the angels and the creatures are like, oh no, this is it. Like this really is going to fall to pieces. But no, right. Love is able to encompass it.
Love wins in the end, and all the endings after that.
Right. Yes.
Just keeps on going. Oh man, this has been so much fun. I've listened to you so much in my head. So it's really fun to, when I say listen to in my head with my headphones on, like, taking a hike, listening to you on a podcast. So it's really fun to actually do it in person, well, as close as we can in person. And thanks so much for your work. I've got a whole bunch of other stuff to talk about, and ask you about, but we should probably save that for another time.
Yeah, we'll do a part 2 and maybe 3. And I really appreciate, Jonathan, the questions that you brought. I don't get to talk about this stuff too often. And so thanks for creating that space.
Well, thank you for answering. I love interdisciplinary kind of stuff, and thinking when I get with a thinker who's really good at this, and then asking them just slightly off kilter, because it's always super interesting. And everything you said was interesting, but it was all worth, especially that ending part there, and just thinking in terms of, love winning in the discordant harmonies and things that evil or whatever we want to call it is introducing, but that love is still just, it's not over yet, right? The world hasn't ended yet, or time hasn't ended yet. And so there's always hope, always hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope people will find you. Search for Footnotes to Plato, Matthew David Segall, my most biblical name we've ever had on the podcast. All right, buddy. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks a lot.
You too.